Okay, we are moving on in the novel Rascal by Sterling North. We are on chapter 6, October. Returning to school had always been a pleasure. It meant new pencils and composition books, the pencils smelling of cedar as you sharpen them. Most of the texts were dog eared and scrawled with unfunny comments and crude drawings. So that just means they're taking the corner of the book, the page, and they're just turning it down so it looks kind of like a dog ear, which you're not supposed to do because it wears the page out. But occasionally we were furnished with two or three books fresh from the presses, fragrant of new paper and printer's ink. The beginning of the school year was particularly memorable because I was entering junior high school. The senior high school pupils who sat in the forward part of the main assembly hall were disdainful of those of us who sat at the rear. But we realized that someday we would be as grand as they, and we had our own loyalties and interests which saved us from suffering too deeply the stigma of being both small and young. At least two of my new teachers were greatly gifted. Miss Stafford made English a delight, and Miss Whalen loved biology as my mother had. My only reluctance upon hearing the first school bell in October 1918 was that I must end my summer with Rascal and lock him firmly in his chicken wire mansion. I had moved Wowzer's large doghouse to a position just outside Rascal's door. It would have been a brave boy or a dog daring to risk intrusion upon my raccoon's privacy. Well aware of his trust, Wowzer lay just outside the cage, his huge muzzle and deep, compassionate eyes turned toward the small prisoner just inside the wire. Rascal, reaching out to his shoulder, patted Wowzer's nose, and the St. Bernard invariably licked the little paw extended in friendship. When Rascal chirred or trilled, Wowzer answered with a big, gruff, affectionate bark, ending sometimes in a howl of sympathy. Donnybrook was also concerned, adding a soft wicker from the nearby padlock. There was real companionship in that backyard. I did what I could to make the imprisonment more bearable. I always shared at least one meal a day in Rascal's cage, and we were together before and after school. I took him to the garden to help me harvest the dry navy beans and Hubbard squashes. He liked to have me rake leaves, burrowing into each bright pile and popping up to surprise me from unexpected places, and he became a real asset in the new job I had taken selling magazines. He attracted customers wherever we went. There must be hundreds of thousands of men who sold the Saturday Evening Post when they were boys, and I joined their ranks during the first week of October. I was very short of cash, and I realized I would have to work harder if I were to earn the money for the canvas for my canoe. Putting Rascal in my bicycle, I pedaled down to the magazine and stationery store owned by Frank Ash, which occupied the building next to the Tobacco Exchange Bank. The big bundles of posts had just arrived on the Thursday train, and each of us took 50 copies as a starter. On the cover was a little girl placing a garland of flowers around a service flag, and I was impressed all over again by the fact that this magazine had been founded by Benjamin Franklin. Either Frank Ash or the circulation manager of the Curtis Publishing Company, and that's the picture, had made a diabolical decision in a desperate attempt to unload another of their periodicals. For each 50 posts, we had to sell 5 copies of The Country Gentleman. Ours was a town filled with retired farmers, but not one of them wanted that magazine. Rascal furnished such an animated sideshow, however, that we often persuaded customers to take both publications. We bicycled through the autumn dusk crying, Saturday Evening Post, 5 cents. Get your post here, mister. 5 cents, only 5 cents. Saturday Evening Post. It was rumored that in biology class, we were to learn the facts of life that year. Most of us had already had some misinformation on the subject. but I was very vague as to how little girls are constructed. However, being not quite 12, I was not in complete despair about my own ignorance. What did puzzle me, however, was how such a lovely, delicate creature as Miss Whalen, with lights in her hair and eyes, could possibly tell a mixed class of how babies are made. Fortunately, this would come much later in the term, and she would have many months to lead up to the subject by way of lesser fauna. Our biology teacher had her own method of inspiring the class. She taught instinctively. If wild geese were noticed crossing the October sky, she would call us all to the windows to hear their distant clangor and to watch them veering southward. She told us how one gander after another took that difficult position at the point of the V, breaking the air resistance for those behind, and how these same brave male birds, sometimes a widowed gander, kept lonely vigil all night, guarding over the flock while the others slept. We are on a branch of the great Mississippi Flyway, she said. That is why we have the wonderful opportunity of watching so many thousands of birds migrating northward in the spring and south again in the autumn. Then she told us that geese, like swans, are mated for life and accompanying each other season after season to rear their goslings in the Arctic and to winter in the southern bayous. That is why it is wicked to shoot a wild goose or a swan, she said. It leaves a widowed mate. On the first day of school, she captured our attention by asking us about our pets. Almost everyone had a cat or dog or canary or pony, but I was the only one in class who had a raccoon. Many animals were invited on various days to attend our biology class. She asked Bob Babcock to bring his little terrier to school and other pupils to bring goldfish, a parrot, and a tame squirrel. But Rascal and I had the honor of receiving the first such invitation. After class, I stayed for a moment to talk to Miss Whalen about my raccoon and to ask her a question which had been intriguing me for several weeks. Do you think raccoons will become human beings sometime? I asked hopefully. Why, Sterling, what a strange idea. Ernest Hooton, who lives next door to us, is studying anthropology, and he has a theory that the hands teach the brain. Yes, Miss Whalen said thoughtfully, possibly they do. And he thinks because our ape like ancestors stood up and used their hands and developed simple tools, their brains developed too. Hmm, that's an exciting idea, my teacher said. Well, my raccoon uses his hands all the time and gets brighter every day. So, in 100 million years or so, couldn't raccoons develop into something like human beings? I think he was hopeful for that because he loves his raccoon. Stranger things have happened, Miss Whalen said. I'm very eager to see your bright raccoon. She gave me a warm smile, but she didn't laugh at me or call my question silly. I left the classroom feeling that Miss Whalen was a very special person. On the morning Rascal was invited, I brushed and combed him until his dark guard hair shone and his gray underfur was as soft as lamb's wool. I used silver polish on his nameplate and saddle soap on his slender collar and leash. After all, it was to be Rascal's first day at school, and I wanted him to make the best possible impression. Fortunately, biology was our first class in the morning, so we didn't have too long to wait. Rascal's behavior was excellent, clean, well groomed, alert, and polite. He sat on Miss Whalen's desk as though he had spent most of his short life addressing biology classes. He asked a few questions about her glass paperweight, which, when shaken, produced a snowstorm over a toy village, and he gently examined this small globe of glass. As you can see, Miss Whalen began, raccoons are curious. Then she wrote on the blackboard, raccoon, an Indian word meaning he who scratches. Slammy Stillman raised his hand. Does he scratch because he has fleas? This produced laughter, and the teacher rapped lightly for order. I raised my hand and was acknowledged. Miss Wayland, Rascal is perfectly clean. He goes swimming every day, and he has never had a flea in his life. I think, said the teacher, the Indians meant raccoons scratch and dig for turtle eggs or other food along the shore. Sometimes they even dig for earthworms. Slammy scowled and slumped deeper in his seat. Does this raccoon remind you of any other animal? Miss Whalen asked. He looks like a little bear, Bud Babcock said. You are right, Bud, the teacher agreed. He is a cousin of the bear and is sometimes called a wash bear because he washes all his food, as we will show you in a few minutes. She took a piece of chalk and again wrote on the blackboard, Procyon loctor, his Latin name, loctor, meaning washer. I was intrigued because Miss Whalen was telling us certain things that I didn't even know about Rascal. Now she brought out a shallow enameled laboratory pan which contained not only water, but, to my surprise, a crayfish. This she put before Rascal on her desk. Now let's see what the raccoon will do. Rascal, like the wonderful little ham he always was, looked around the class and off through the windows while running his hands with a kneading motion all over the shallow pan. He knew exactly where the crayfish was, but he was showing off. Suddenly, his body stiffened for a pounce, and 2 seconds later, he had his prey fast in his grip and was washing it blissfully in anticipation of his feast. By this time, the class was as happy as Rascal, and almost everybody clapped. Raccoons are omnivores, Miss Whalen said, writing the word on the blackboard. This means they will eat almost anything. They live from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from southern Canada to Mexico. They have from 2 to 6 raccoon kits every May, usually in a hollow tree, and these kits mind their mother very well, trundling after her as she teaches them how to fish the edge of the creeks. They are friendly animals unless attacked, but can kill a dog if backed into a corner. Miss Whalen asked me if I would briefly tell of my experiences with my raccoon, and I stood before the class, petting Rascal as I talked. I think we had the attention of all but Slammy, particularly when Rascal climbed on my shoulder and started vaguely playing with my ear. I could I even sleep with him sometimes, I confessed. He's a wonderful pet. Everyone wanted to touch him after that. So, one by one, my classmates came up and petted him, some of the girls pretending to be a little frightened. Slammy was last of the line, and he slouched up, shifty eyed and sneering. I was watching for trouble, but the moment was too late. Just as he reached the raccoon, Slammy stretched a heavy rubber band and snapped Rascal in the face. Very rarely before had I heard Rascal emit his scream of rage. But this was pure fury, fight to the death cry. And in a split second, Rascal sank his fine, sharp teeth into Slammy's fat hand. Slammy yelled until you could have heard him in the assembly hall. He danced around, shaking his hand, screaming, Mad Coon, you gotta shoot him now, Mad Coon. While Miss Whalen's voice was cold and severe. Slammy Stillman, everyone in the room saw what you did. If you think this is a mad raccoon, then you need no other punishment than the worry you will experience wondering if indeed you have rabies. Class is dismissed. Sterling, will you stay for a moment? I didn't know what my teacher would decree, but it proved almost as severe a punishment as she had given Slammy. She said, I'm sorry, but under the circumstances, you will have to cage your raccoon constantly for the next 14 days. If he should show signs of rabies, we would still have time to get pasture treatments for Slammy. But he isn't rabid, I protested. You saw what happened. I certainly did, and I feel certain he is a perfectly healthy animal, but we can't take a chance. She was silent for a moment. When she turned back to me, her mood had changed and she said quietly, Rascal is a wonderful pet. Thank you for bringing him to class and for your good oral report. So now rabies, if it's not treated in a certain amount of time, there's nothing you can do and you die from it. So she knew that they had to be sure that Rascal didn't show signs of rabies so that Slammy Stillman was okay. But if he did show signs, they would give him treatment that would prevent him from getting sick. She petted the raccoon and added, You better take him home to his cage, Sterling. I'll explain to the other teachers why you'll be absent the rest of the day. As I pedaled homeward with Rascal in the bicycle basket, he had already forgotten his recent fight. It was a crisp, clear autumn day as we entered the cage to begin the 2 week sentence. I had a crazy, affectionate thought. If they lock up Rascal, they'll have to lock me up with them. We sat eating soft shelled pecans, wishing we could stay side by side forever, sharing a meal with and each other's company. Slammy unfortunately did not die of rabies. In fact, the punctures in his hand healed almost immediately, but the punishment inflicted on Rascal and me continued. We were jailmates for many hours a day as I could join him. Rascal was beginning to get slightly plump in preparation for winter. I gave him any food he wanted, so we were not too unhappy in his cage. On the 14th day of his confinement, when he had not shown a single sign of any sickness, I opened the door and we frisked out into the autumn world. We walked up the street to Crescent Drive and turned down the country lane through a world ablaze with autumn. It was Indian summer. The corn shocks, pale as buckskin teepees, pointed upward to the immense blue curve of sky, and maples flamed along the ridges. As we passed Bardine's orchard, we helped ourselves to a few apples. Farther down the lane, where fences were garlanded with wild grapes, Rascal dyed his muzzle purple with this pure pigment. Each autumn, it was necessary to examine the hickory and walnut trees we hoped to raid, and to estimate the number of muskrats living in sloughs and ponds where we hoped to trap. This was a jaunt I usually took with my trapping and hickory nutting partner, Oscar Sutherland. Oscar was not home, however, so Rascal and I made the survey without him. On the bank of the swimming hole, we came upon a sorrowful sight of a great walnut stump, where a giant tree had been standing only a few months before. I had often rested in the shade of that tree and gathered its nuts in the autumn, staining my hands dark brown with the hulls. Here, too, I had captured the only royal walnut moth in my collection. Now the trunk had been cut for rifle stocks, as had so many walnut trees that season. It's a little sad. It kind of reminds me of the book The Giving Tree, actually. Um, I found a red writing stone in the creek, and in big, angry letters printed out on the stump, and I'm not going to say this word, it's a bad word about the man who cut this tree. Gradually, forgot my anger, however, as we skirted the marshes and ponds to the north. Never before had I seen so many muskrat houses, those conical pile of reeds with underwater entrances, which made such perfect homes for these harmless and interesting fur bearing rodents. So, a conical is a cone shaped. And as you can see, it's kind of cone shaped. I had raised several muskrat kits and turned them loose in other years. I could never bear to kill and skin those I had reared by hand. Rascal and I sat silently beside a marshy pond where a few mallards and black ducks were tipping and preening. As evening began to fall, the muskrats came quietly from their half finished houses and began to cut cattails, which they carried in their mouths through the still water to pile upon their homes. We wandered happily back to town through the dusk, the flame of the maples muted in the dying light. And now that is the end of chapter 8, October.